Living objects. The life of a museum curator is like that of an actor or a biographer, becoming totally absorbed in the belongings of dead people through their things, art, their notes, letters, sketchbooks, following their train of thought and motivations. It's an immersive process, and perhaps we might forgive them for becoming obsessed. A factory reanimating the dead. The museum is made of cut sandstone blocks and ceremonial pride. Its hollow spaces are filled with echoes. The museum was built for the purpose of standing back and admiring, to look at history's detritus and spoils. It smells like alien dust and windoline. The objects sit floating, the gigantic space around them more distracting than illuminating. Natasha is a museum curator in her early 30s. She doesn't really look you in the eye, no eye-to-eye contact, unless she's talking about her collections at the museum. She wears tailored clothes with tiny flashes of immaculately curated jewellery. She always has little details within her outfits, cleverly concealed sophistication. She spends all day with her objects. The more research she does, the better she feels she knows them. She adjusts the relative humidity in the cases as the weather turns colder. Outside, a mother pulls up a blanket around a baby's face. She feels emotional when learning about her objects' histories. She talks to them. She feels bereft when an object goes out on loan. She always tries to think of a reason to refuse a loan to another museum if she possibly can. They are her children. She has no human children. She only thaws with others if they show a great deal of interest and enthusiasm for her objects. She has a human connection to the objects. She talks to them. They don't speak human. She only partially speaks object. There will always be a barrier. But the curator continues to work away at the invisible glass wall, hoping that one day there will be full human object comprehension. There won't, of course, if objects do hold secrets from the past, which they do. They will never tell them all to us. Far cleverer than humanity, these silent witnesses know that once they do reveal all, we won't revere or value them anymore. Their status depends upon their loaded silence. Robian is the head curator. He is Natasha's senior at the museum. He is controlled, ambitious, and the epitome of refinement. He speaks 7 languages, including Latin and ancient Greek. He isn't often at the museum. He gives lectures about the collection all over the world. A consummate specialist, he is an expert in his particular field. Natasha always tries to emulate him. She absorbs every word he has ever said about the objects, a human sponge. He knows everything that it is humanly possible to know about the collections. Natasha is also highly competitive with Robian. She privately feels that she is more intimate with the objects physically, more familiar in that she holds them more often. She knows every crack, every crevice, every scratch, every flake of removed varnish, as a school nurse knows each bruise or scratch on the children within her care. Robian's face was almost perfect. He was in his early 50s. His skin was alabaster and only very slightly pockmarked. He was an academic curator, most at home with his fellow academics. Natasha is a curator who feels safest with her objects. He sought only knowledge and the status that came with it. He didn't care for the objects themselves. For her, the object blood ties were most important. He only sought adulation from his peers. She sought the confidence and knowledge of her object family. He had a wife and 2 children. They don't come to the museum much apart from very special museum openings. Some objects hold more of the spirit of the people that own them than others. It depends upon the emotional porosity of the object, how much it can blot up or be marked, imprinted upon, worn into or stained. It depends how much human contact it has had and whether it had a long-term connection with one human. Some objects were with their human at a time of great pain or tragedy. These objects are more marked. We can see instantly if a person has had a traumatic experience. It's written on their face. So then, can we feel if an object has endured something terrible or tragic? The Roman burial urn was a star object within the museum's displays. It had a deep gash in its side. It feels cracked, broken, fractured, emotional. We might identify it as depressed and unable to hold itself together. But it had no choice because an invisible hard aluminium support prevents it from fragmenting, like a partner that won't let their other half have a breakdown, dragging them along, determined to deny the horrid truth of the situation. The metal support is under tremendous strain and pressure too, the strain symbiosis. Staying complete is a labour without love. Conservators work on the urn every year, coaxing and empathising it with their glue and brushes, coercing it to stay complete. They can't mend the invisible wounds, though, the emotional scarring. Natasha usually enjoys the final look-up at the end of each working day. A quick check around every gallery and a quick glance at every case, just in case an object has fallen over, been attacked by moths, or developed some kind of hideous new mould since her last check. Her enjoyment becomes something else once the reception team have left the building. She's the last one to shut up the object's doors and walk back through the main gallery. She walks a little quicker, as if suddenly haunted by the shadows of the stories whose likeness has fascinated her all day. Once dark and alone, she runs the last bit across the slippery marble in the atrium to the heavy wooden door. The sinister feelings of the inside overwhelming her, nearly free, she calms just a little, setting the alarm, bolts the door 3 times and turns 3 keys in their locks. She glances down at her briefcase. There is a baby in the bag. Not a real baby, of course, an object baby. But it's okay. She can't bear to be apart from her favourite, even overnight. No harm done. She will sneak it back into the museum tomorrow. The following day, Natasha is tired and has eye strain. She's been writing strategic plans for the museum and is under increasing pressure. The future of the museum, ensuring that future was bright, consumed all of her energy. The continuation of her object species. That night, she went to the urn. Her head was frazzled, her thoughts darting around. Her perfect hair was uncharacteristically flawed and falling in her eyes. Her eyes met the rim of the urn and stayed there. She felt its empathy. It brought her comfort. It gave her strength. Then she did something strange. She walked to Robion's office and opened the 3rd drawer down on the left-hand side of his desk. She found it straight away under the files. She knew where he kept it, an unfamiliar bottle of scent. He kept it there for special meetings after hours. Natasha allowed herself just one tiny spritz. There's something enthralling about smelling a smell that's not quite intended for you. The following day, Robion and Natasha were having their monthly meeting. Robion was describing some new research he'd been sent relating to their Greek statue collection. Natasha was listening intently, then her eye wandered to the contour of Robion's neck. She tuned into one of her objects. A painting was wincing. Through the window she could see one of the front of house staff moving a chair perilously close to the painting. She shot out the door, leaving Robion in conversational mid-flow to prevent her painting from being scratched. Like a father dismissing a mother's fussing, he sighed. His research interests far outweighed the more mundane domestic custodial responsibilities. The graveyard. That night Natasha was working late. She was supposed to be meeting a researcher who hadn't turned up, the most disrespectful thing in the world. She spent most of the day retrieving the items he'd requested from all over the stores. and at 4:55 p.m. the researcher had sent an email to say his flight had been severely delayed. He had other calls on his time that week and would have to cancel his visit. Natasha read the email at 5:15 p.m. when the last of the reception staff were just leaving. For security reasons, she couldn't leave the objects out in the research room. Silently furious at the lack of consideration for her precious objects, who were looking forward to being looked at, she carefully started packing them away in temporary boxes to return them to their cases and places in the stores. This task took over an hour, by which time everyone else had gone home. The museum had become a burial ground. The old people's home. Would she have stayed late that night if she had known what was about to happen? It is impossible to explain what that really was, but needless to say, Natasha no longer saw herself projected into the objects. That night, the objects revealed themselves to her. Her heart, she heard their screaming voices for the first time. That night, Natasha discovered that some souls choose to spend eternity in an object which they found sympathy with. The 7,000-year-old Egyptian lady, her joints so painful that she had to keep completely still, her eyes closed. She keeps being conserved. She just wants to be left alone. She feels tired, tortured by enforced living, so exhausted. She doesn't want to be moved or looked at or researched or studied. She's been analysed almost to death. Her lips have thinned to weathered string, her muscles wasted. She cannot speak any more. Her skin is hymn book paper thin. Surely by now they must know everything they could possibly need to know about her. They can't polish her any more. She doesn't like all the noise and chatter of the other objects at night, or the bright lights during the day in the museum. All the other objects are so noisy. It disturbs her quiet. It's a zoo by day, a care home by night, endless purgatory. It makes Natasha inexplicably think about her mother's last few days. She couldn't speak, but her eyes looked into Natasha's, perhaps making some non-verbal apologies. Natasha shakes the thought from her mind. But the voices are everywhere, even the preserved dragonfly who was gassed by an insect collector, who is now terrified of being breathed upon in the entomology section. Reclusive, reluctant objects who silently wail in their cases. The objects still so affected by their experience. Objects like the very ordinary token left with a baby whom its mother was forced to give away. A symbol of all that pain and innocence is far too young to feel. A promise of pain, a promise of a faint, tiny glimmer of love from a past unknown, a maternal shadow. Natasha never really liked these objects. She felt sick. Something was stuck in her throat. She didn't want to think about unborn lives or motherless lives or anything in that vein. The crematorium. Can you hear the voices? If you could touch those objects, would you get closer to those feelings yourself? None of their stories were the ones Natasha was expecting, and most were more horrific, more tragic, more banal, more mundane than you could ever imagine. All of the voices that she previously thought she was hearing were inside her own head. The new real voices felt strange, comic, unfamiliar and disconnected, and she could only hear them if she touched the objects. These new voices didn't chime with what Natasha already knew. They didn't often make sense. Natasha felt washed out, so she washed her hands and went home. But the next day she was all too aware of the truth. It was all ruined for her. She knew too much. It became too painful to be around those objects. Those lives boiled down into the reduction of object form. A researcher arrived the next day. Natasha welcomed the fellow human more warmly than usual. She did her best to answer his questions of interrogation about her children. Then anger, frustration and nausea quickly overwhelmed her. She was wading out of her knowledge depth. She interrupted Robin's research to enable him to talk to the researcher. Admiration overwhelmed Natasha as she observed the craftsmanship of Robin's adept answers. Robin could tell within a minute that this researcher was an enormous time-wasting enthusiast. Robin's precious time could not possibly be frittered away upon such a person. He gave the coded signal to Natasha. She interrupted again on cue. Excuse me, Robin, the amber alarm has gone off in the painting store. Duty calls, please accept my apologies. And Robin quickly rounded the door. He brushed Natasha's fingertip outside of the door, just an innocent gesture of thanks. It was just an accident to Robin, who was dead to touch. Natasha spent the next 2 days analysing the abstract sensations she felt. Shock? Desire? A statue touched her. 2 days later, they were back in another meeting. Robin grew more animated as it grew steadily darker outside and in the room. Eventually, they were sat in the intimacy of semi-darkness. Another member of staff walked in and turned the lights on. Natasha was surprised at the flash of anger she felt at the interruption. Robin didn't notice and continued to talk about his favourite, a painting he'd been researching for decades. The temples on his face, his cheekbones and the length of his nose beautifully lit by the soft apricot streetlight outside the window. Jana is a mostly beaming lady in her late 50s. She is the esteemed museum director. She used to do Robin's job and she is his senior. She enjoys his sycophantic attentions and encourages ambitions to an extent. Robin has designs on her job. They like to discuss plans for the museum over dinner after hours. They share a love of wine and the 18th century ceramic collection. His wife wonders why quite so many dinners discussing the future of the museum are necessary. The museum had acquired a new painting called The Cuckold's Revenge. Robin doesn't like the sinister look on the wife's face. It resembled something too much. He refuses to have it hung in the gallery. It's gathering dust in the stall. Maybe we can't handle the untold truths. If we knew absolutely everything, what would drive future human endeavour? These are the questions Natasha contemplates. That accidental flash of touch still playing on her fingertips. Natasha leaves work early. She goes directly to a bar where she knows that others tend to gather after work. She sits. She drinks. She puts her phone away. She means business. She bumps into someone whose intended dinner guest has made other plans at the last minute. Out of the museum confine, controlled furtive feelings blossom uncontrollably. She plans to make her own real human connection this evening. It works. Tableau. Looking in through the frame of the window from the grey street on a January day, we see two unremarkable people in a high-ceilinged office in a very crammed city. A man with a very slight grey bruise above his left eye on his otherwise beautiful face. A woman with an imperceptible glow of one who has touched a statue intimately. The desks face each other. Their computers prevent their direct gaze, and the man stares into his virtual space, meditating upon how objects are really people, frozen in time, and that people are merely objects that can walk and talk. Suddenly the man glares at us. Voyeurs! Go away! And we must look away, feigning disinterest, and move on. It would be rude to do anything else. These waxworks weren't created to be looked at. They don't want to tell us their stories. The more we look, the less we see. They can't help the transparency of the glass. They have no story to share with us. Compelled without knowing why, we look away. We must move on.